In his memoir of Alan Chadwick, The Master Gardener, a book entitled There is a Garden in the Mind, the philosopher Paul Lee correctly identifies the Arcadian theme in Chadwick's horticulture. Chadwick himself described his methods as classical. Lee places Chadwick in the great historical struggle between physicalism and vitalism, and he invokes Poussin's painting The Shepherd in Arcadia as the leaf motif of Chadwick's work. Here is the introduction to that book. There is a famous painting by Poussin that hangs in the Louvre, The Shepherds of Arcadia. 4 shepherd youths pause in an abandoned garden wilderness deep in reflective meditation. They are looking at the inscription on a tomb which reads, Et in Arcadia ego, and I am in Arcadia. It is sepulchral voice, affirming the goodness and sweetness of life after it has been lived. I too am in Arcadia, having lived and enjoyed the fruits of youth, just as you in your reverie gaze upon me, death in the midst of life. I've thought of this Arcadian outcry as the wistful voice of the end of the culture of old Europe, saying goodbye in the face of the emerging industrial and technological society, the graveyard of Western culture. I also think of the Arcadian tomb as the tomb of refuted vitalism, what had to be sacrificed in the face of the emerging industrial technology, the affirmation of the integrity of organic nature, affirming what was and would be no more, vitalism entombed. With uncanny prescience, Poussin and Goethe, who also used the Arcadian phrase, give expression to the end of the Western cultural epoch in their awareness of the tragedy of culture and the triumph of an ontology of death in the industrial society to come, and the overwhelming success of the view known as physicalism, the materialist reductionist philosophy of modern science. Lee found in Chadwick a revival, that is the right word, revival, of vitalism against the ontology of death. He was a man from old Europe who, in the midst of modern America, had an Arcadian vision. In Chadwick's case, the intellectual pedigree was through Goethe, half digested. Lee wanted to frame Chadwick in these terms: a visionary, a latter-day representative of the great vitalist tradition of Europe that had been eclipsed by industrialism and the mechanisation of life. It is well to remember that on the campus at Santa Cruz, where Chadwick first made his now famous garden, and where he held forth about the evils of industrial agriculture, there were members of the faculty deeply involved in the development of pesticides and artificial fertilisers. Chadwick made enemies on campus. But as Lee saw it, it was a microcosm of a broader struggle, one at the heart of our civilization. In its modern history, let's face it, vitalism had died with the Nazis. There was a strong ecological environmentalist component to National Socialism. Healthy living, clean food, reverence for the soil, for the forests of the fatherland, and so forth. The Nazis had appropriated German vitalism, and with the war it was swept away. Natural was a dirty word. Post-war optimism was about being modern, progressive, up-to-date, scientific, space age, all mod cons, until cracks began to appear in that complacency, and the ecological crisis provoked a search for alternatives. Paul Lee saw the counterculture of the 1960s as a swing back to vitalism after the arid modernity of the 50s, and the rediscovery of a tradition to which the Nazis had no proper claim. Chadwick appeared, the wild Shakespearean. He was a classical man, Amidst the raging countercultural ferment of California in those days, he came from another time. He had no patience for rock music and drugism, as he called it. He was an unlikely hero of the hippies. Yet he embodied life in himself, in his garden, in his philosophy. A key Chadwick word is fresh. Life is only true when it is fresh. Somehow the plants that Alan grew were abundant with life, replete with vitality, this quality of fresh. They don't seem like the weary vegetables of late capitalism. It is as if they were grown on the first morning of the world. In that sense, Arcadian. A Chadwick garden invokes Arcadia. What we want is to create conditions such as they were at the dawn of time, so to speak, before the great god Pan had died and the ontology of death crept into the world. Lee doesn't interpret Poussin's painting as a simple memento mori, but finds the theme of the lost paradise. In some countercultural gardening, there is a conscious return to the primitive. The no-dig method, for instance. In its theory, it proposes that cultivating the soil was a fundamental mistake, a violence on the world. It's often taken a feminist form, this theory, the plough as male violence. Similarly, permaculture in its theoretical frame proposes a post-industrial return to the easygoing days of the hunter-gatherer, minimum labour, passive design, picking food from the trees. But this is to confuse the primitive with the primordial. The primordial isn't the subject of fashionable anthropologies. It refers to a mythic time, a once upon a time, a dream time, and that is Arcadia, when the world was new, when things grew true, and the soil was as black as the space between the stars, and sylphs ran in the glades. It's a great theme in classical literature. The primary text is the eclogues of Virgil. The real roots of Chadwick Horticulture are there in that ancient mythology. It doesn't look back to primitive models. It looks back to classical models. Paul Lee was right to place Chadwick in that Arcadian tradition. Organic horticulture of any stripe is, implicitly at least, a rejection of the scientific industrial paradigm. It is a return to the ways of the past. Some things just shouldn't be industrialised. But to what older vision do we want to return? For some in the counterculture, and it's a strong theme in the counterculture, they look to tribal life and pre-colonial peoples, First Nations as they're called, as models for ecological sustainability. Chadwick's sources were the aristocratic farming of pre-industrial Europe, medieval and ancient, and he held the French peasant, the paysan, in high esteem. He was a real aristocrat, Chadwick, by temperament. Aristocrats respect peasants. It's the middle class they hate. That explains a lot about Alan Chadwick. To be clear, he never thought of his own methods of gardening as his own. He would hate the designation Chadwick Horticulture. He would say, "What do you want about sausage? It's just classical horticulture. It's normal horticulture." Or it was until this modern nonsense got going. The French horticulture he learnt had ancient Roman roots. He would reference ancient writers. He saw himself in a long tradition. Let us go with Virgil and call it Arcadian, the European vitalist tradition with its roots in ancient classical civilization. Chadwick's boyhood tutor, Rudolf Steiner, was very much in the German vitalist tradition of Paracelsus. Steiner's biodynamics was eclipsed somewhat by the war, but sensibly Steiner set up camp in neutral Switzerland. Chadwick in fact never used Steiner's biodynamics, or not the so-called preparations that feature in it, but there's no doubt that he was on the same page as Steiner and had a deep understanding of all of that, even while being his own man. There's also the fact, of course, that Chadwick was himself a man in love with life. He had amazing personal vitality. He boasted he was a better ballet dancer than his friend Nureyev. Young men, 18, 19-year-olds, who worked with him reported that they couldn't keep up. His cry would be, "Qui vive?" Watchfulness, look alive. That is how we situate Chadwick Horticulture in the Arcadian tradition. Abundant life, a vitalist project, necessarily at odds with the gross physicalism of our age. Plants are not machines. Life defies physics and the dead hand of chemistry. Who wants to live on Mars anyway? Another way to put it is, a Chadwick garden is an enchanted garden. Pastoral. In its vitality, it invokes Arcadia, fresh, like the dawn of the living world, a place where Pan can play his pipes. There is a serious pursuit of this type of deep, original vitality. The techniques are calculated to optimize vitality. Optimum vitality, that is the objective. That is the Arcadian quality. Someone who saw Chadwick's gardens when they were young told me in private correspondence that they had seen magnificent gardens in their life. Superb gardens, beautiful gardens on 3 continents. But there was a quality to Chadwick's gardens that was beyond them all and hard to define. They were just more alive. Optimum vitality. But make no mistake, Arcadia is long lost. The conditions of the world have changed. Nature needs redeeming. As Chadwick would have it, the world has become compacted. It requires radical cultivation to restore the pristine order. Arcadia is an expansion of our realms. People who undertake Chadwick horticulture should reflect on these things. There's an intellectual tradition behind it that Paul Lee identified, a philosophy of the soil, historical and cultural themes, and a mythology and a vision.